All right, today we're going to be continuing our message series in the book of Acts. And so we'll actually be rounding out the very last part of chapter 22 and then moving through chapter 23. I want to invite you to turn there in your Bibles. If by chance you're with us this morning and didn't happen to bring a Bible with you, I'll mention under the seat in front of you, you should find one that looks exactly like mine. If you grab that, you can turn to page 1118 and cut right to the passage that we're looking at. Today we're going to talk about talking to Jesus with people who are really resistant to hearing about it. And I don't know where God finds everybody here this morning, but I would wager probably most of you who are established Christians have tried to have some of those conversations before. Maybe you've interacted with somebody who seemed like you were kind of hitting a brick wall with them. And it can be a really tough situation, especially if it's someone that you have a friendship with or a relationship with, because it might feel like it's going to damage the relationship to have the conversation. And yet, what we're going to talk about today is, in spite of that, God actually wants us to step up and to have those conversations when the opportunities are open. Now, I'm not saying you go harass that person and every time you meet them you hit them over the head with a Bible. That's not what we're talking about. But I am saying that God often gives us opportunities to share who He is, even with harder-hearted people, so that they'll have that opportunity to hear the truth and respond to it. And, you know, the crazy part is, and often we don't think about this, that for many people in your life, you might be the closest thing to Jesus Christ that they ever see. That's a little scary thought, isn't it? And yet, God calls us to step up and have those conversations. Paul has already had some of those conversations with a group who literally wants to kill him. And yet he's been bold in doing it. And we're going to hear today about how God responds to that, and also how Paul's life continues to move forward in light of that. Just as a reminder, for context's sake, we've been working through the book of Acts. And as we've been talking about it, we've seen that the Apostle Paul has returned after his third missionary journey to Jerusalem. When Paul got there, the leaders of the church were highly concerned because they said, Paul, you're here, that's great, we love to hear about what's going on, and we're interested in that. But the downside is, there's a whole lot of people here who've heard a whole lot of bad rumors about you. And they think that you're saying we should just entirely reject the Jewish law and sacrificial system, and that anybody who's Jewish should reject that. And of course, that accusation wasn't true. That wasn't Paul's message to people as he was on his missionary journeys. He had said that people who weren't raised Jewish and who were unbelievers in Judaism coming to Christianity did not have to follow the entire law themselves. But he never told the Jewish people that they should actually reject it in the process. Nonetheless, some believers, particularly from the province of Asia, where Paul had spent about 3 years in his previous missionary journey, had come in and they stirred up among the people this dissent. Paul ended up going to the temple with a group of friends. They followed the law, and coming there, they didn't bring any outsiders with them. But when they came, some of those Jewish believers from Asia saw him, and they saw their opportunity. So they stirred up the crowd around them in the temple and said, this guy is causing all kinds of trouble all over. He's rejecting the law of Moses. He's brought a Gentile into the temple, which he hadn't. And so they throw all these accusations at Paul, and the group begins to beat him mercilessly to within an inch of his life. Eventually, Roman troops come in from the Tower of Antonia next door to the temple, seeing that there's a big commotion and not knowing whether this is a riot that's meant to overthrow the government or whether this is just some religious dispute. They send in their troops, they grab Paul, and they rescue him. And upon interrogating Paul and beginning to question him, they realize he's a Roman citizen, and so they actually do refrain from giving him a beating, which they had meant to do and which was lawful for them as Roman rulers to do. And so as our story sort of wound down, last week we saw Paul had preached a message of his testimony to all of the people who were trying to kill him. Then he was questioned by the Roman commander in the area, and ultimately the commander is held on to him because he still doesn't really know what the truth is about Paul. Is he actually somebody who's trying to stir up and overthrow the government? Is this just a religious dispute that's going on? How do we answer those questions? And today we're going to see that ruler try to seek out some of those answers. Now, before we go to that, I have the next slide here, which I want to use just to briefly describe you. We talk about a lot of positions in the Roman government, and thank goodness these positions don't all exist today, and this isn't our government. We can be grateful for that we have the freedoms that we do. But as we're talking about it, I wanted to just clarify it, and particularly talk about what the Roman Empire did in certain states or provinces, areas that they had conquered, such as Judea, this region where Jerusalem's at. So they have somebody who rules over that. So just to talk about the military hierarchy, because it's going to play into our passage today, I want to clarify it. First of all, of course, you have Caesar. Caesar, early on in the Roman Empire, was not actually a dictatorial ruler. He was in a democratic position. His position was particularly filled when there was a time of war and the empire was threatened. And the original paradigm in the Roman Empire had been, after this great outside threat had been put down and pacified, that whoever was Caesar would step back from that position, that he would yield his power back to the Senate and go on with life. Well, with Julius Caesar, this changed quite a bit. And so from him onward, we had several different rulers, and also started one of the wealthiest times in Roman history, as Rome turned into an empire that was conquering others around them and taking in vast amounts of wealth from that. So in Paul's day, there's a Caesar in charge who has dictatorial power. He allows the Senate to have some powers, but it's pretty limited. And then each of those Caesars, knowing there's a different state in effect that they have to have commanded, they would appoint governors to those areas. And so that person would be responsible for making sure that there was no civil unrest, that people weren't going to try to rebel against the Roman government, and the governor would oversee that whole region. He would have judicial power, and he could sort of, as the federal government leader, give prison sentences out. He could try people himself and decide who's innocent and guilty, who lives, who dies. And in our passage today, we're going to hear about the governor, who is recorded, as is often the case, is recorded both in the New Testament, but also outside of the New Testament. In several places, the historian Josephus tells us about him, and his name is Felix. So we'll hear about a guy named Felix. He is the governor of this region, and actually Felix in his day actually has a few different states that he commands big chunks of. He's not a terribly effective ruler, but he does have a lot of favor with Caesar, and so he gets a big swath of land to manage. Now, under Felix is a tribune, or in the NIV version, often he'll just be referred to as a commander. And so a tribune would have been a soldier who was sort of like a general, and he was responsible for overseeing 1,000 troops. There would have been 10 different groups of 100 underneath him that he commanded. And he would have had 740 infantrymen and about 260 cavalrymen on average. That's typically the configuration that was used for a tribune to command. And if the governor is not in the tribune's area, then the tribune is the next person in line. So they're in charge of everything in that realm, which is why we hear about Claudius Lysias, who's in our passage today, also who's recorded outside the Bible. We often see this. It's interesting. The Bible talks about real places, real people, real things that actually happened. And so we see these other accounts of it happening. It's one of the great things that speaks to the authenticity of Scripture as authoritative, not just from a religious perspective, but even just as a historical document. Finally, below each tribune is going to be 10 centurions, and we'll hear of a centurion mentioned today. So that's 10 people who are responsible for commanding 100 men. And that's the rough breakup. Now, of course, if they were short on troops or had an excess of troops, those numbers could expand or contract slightly, just depending on the circumstances they're in. But in this case, there is a tribune commanding 1,000 people who is in Jerusalem itself. And Jerusalem has a history of being a somewhat troublesome region. There's a lot of civil unrest that happens in Jerusalem. The Jewish people are not terribly happy about being under Roman authority. And so rebellions are not unheard of. That's part of why we have such a huge troop presence in this city. So with that context in mind, let's go ahead and we'll open our Bibles. And again, we're on page 1118. We're going to start with chapter 22, verse 30, and we'll actually begin by reading verses 30 through chapter 23, verse 5. Before we do that, please join me just for a moment of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to gather together and to study your word. Lord, I pray that we would not just increase in knowledge today, but that we would increase in obedience. That your Spirit guide us to have open hearts to what you have to say. Lord, we pray that you would be glorified in all that happens. And we ask these things in Jesus Christ's name and Mary. Amen. All right, chapter 22, verse 30. The commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. So the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." At this, the high priest, Ananias, ordered those standing near Paul to strike him in the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law. that you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck." Those who were standing near Paul said, "How dare you insult God's high priest?" Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest. For it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" Okay, so as our passage opens up, we see that our local tribune, Lysias, is still trying to come to the answer to the question of what's really up with this Paul guy. There were a lot of false accusations launched after Paul was beaten. Some people were saying he was a terrorist, and effectively saying he's somebody like Osama bin Laden. Other people were saying he has desecrated the temple, he's brought people in who shouldn't be here, or that he's undermining the law of Moses. The tricky part here is that the Roman federal government doesn't have a whole lot of laws about undermining Jewish faith. They're not really concerned about that. They're a pagan government, and that's the least of their concerns. And so, in this case, Lysias arranges to have Paul go before the Sanhedrin. And his hope is, if I can put this guy in front of this ruling council, then hopefully we'll get to the bottom of it. They'll come out and say whatever it is that he's done that's so bad, and then I'll know I'm not letting a murderer or somebody like that go, or a terrorist, or if I need to punish him, I can do that. And so he's trying to feel all this out. But obviously Lysias, whose part of his job is to keep the peace in Jerusalem, must also know that if he releases Paul, and even if it's for the wrong reasons, if most of the people in Jerusalem want him dead, then he could still have that riot on his hands. And if things go sideways, he'll answer for it, and he might even lose his job over it. So he's got to be really cautious about this situation. Now, naturally, the question arises, where on earth did they meet? Because we hear that they're not meeting in the Tower of Antonia, the main Roman structure where their military forces are housed, right next door to the temple. And so, to show you that, we'll jump to the next slide here, and we can see this is the temple itself, which is next door to the Tower of Antonia. And you can see the big blue arrow points to where the Hall of Hewn Stone would be. Now, there is an actual doorway to it from outside of this main area of the temple. So you could get in from outside of that. Typically that inner walled area where you see in the temple, if you were a Gentile, you would never be allowed there. In fact, it would be a major no-no for you to be anywhere near it. And yet we're going to hear Roman troops are actually in this area. Part of why they're allowed there is because they're actually going to use an external door to get there. Now, this area, we'll jump to the next slide and we can see a picture of it. It's called the Hall of Hewn Stone, and it's the traditional meeting place for the Sanhedrin. This temple was built by Herod the Great, and in it is the only version of the temple in the history of over time it's been rebuilt that actually has a quarter set up for the Sanhedrin to meet. Now we hear this term, the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin are a council of 71 men, and those 71 men would have been religious experts and political leadership in Israel who were given authority over the nation, over a lot of their civil administration. And at the head of them, as you can see at the very high point of the room there, is where the high priest would sit. And they would sit there to decide normal business matters for the nation of Israel, but also to do any sort of trial that are on a civil level. And so Paul, we can imagine, is probably standing right in the middle of it here. And if there are guards present, they may be in the student seating watching what's going on. And all of these men have gathered around. And with this, we have Lysias standing in the background, no doubt, trying to figure out what is happening. And the first thing that happens is Paul walks forward and he begins to address the group. He says to them, "You guys, I come before you in front of God with a clean conscience. I haven't done anything wrong. I've only done what I thought was right, what God was leading me to, and so I'm innocent." And this makes sense because even in our country, typically one of the first things you do when you go into court and you're being accused of a crime is to say right up front, "I'm guilty, you can throw the book at me," or "I'm completely innocent, this is all made up, none of it's true." And in this case, Paul comes out and he says right off the bat, "I am not guilty of this at all." Now the chief priest, Ananias, responds to this by telling somebody standing near to Paul, "Punch that guy in the mouth. That'll solve this." It's an odd thing to request, and especially an odd thing to request from the religious head of the group. It doesn't sound like a very pastoral thing to do, does it? I don't like what he's saying, so we should probably just punch him in the mouth. Paul responds to that in a pretty heated way, and he calls Ananias a whitewashed tomb, and basically says, "It's really ironic here that you're going to order that I be punched in the face because you think I broke the law, when in fact you ordering somebody to punch me in the face is itself a violation of the law. There's nowhere in the law of Moses where it says the chief priest can punch people in the mouth whenever he wants. That would have been a handy provision, I imagine, for Ananias, but it's not actually there. And so Paul basically is saying you're taking the law so seriously, and I'm not, but you're violating it in what you've even asked. Now, the response from those around is to say, hold on here, you just insulted the chief priest. And so we see Paul obviously didn't quite know who the chief priest was, which raises a question about how he didn't. Now, to answer that question, let me point out a few things that are probably coming into play. First of all, Paul, you might recall, decades before, had actually been sent out by Caiaphas, the chief priest at the time, to round up and arrest Christians. And Ananias was alive then and was in the picture. He's a family member of Caiaphas, but he wasn't acting as the head priest. And so if Paul had interactions, he probably most prominently had them with Caiaphas, who is now dead. He's no longer in that position. And so now, somebody he doesn't recognize is before him. So this is also a few decades later, so even if he had seen an Ananias, it's possible with 20 years. 20 years can cause a person to look a little bit different, right? That might be a factor. And finally, we see mentioned in the epistles, in the letters that Paul writes to the various churches, that Paul by this stage is already starting to struggle with some vision issues. His sight is beginning to fail, and so that also is probably a factor in how he doesn't immediately recognize the chief priest. Because when he realizes that's who he's talking to, because the Bible commands that you be respectful to the leadership, even if you don't particularly care for them, Paul realizes, okay, I was a little out of line there. I'll step that back. Sorry about that. I think it's good to note, Paul's accusation is actually quite accurate against Ananias. He stands in history as one of the least effective and likable chief priests that ever ruled in Israel. And that has to do for a few reasons. First of all, he, like his father-in-law Caiaphas before him, went and paid Caesar in order to purchase the position of chief priest. Typically, the Sanhedrin would look for the best and brightest among them, and they would appoint that person to be chief priest of Israel. But in Caiaphas and Ananias' case, they went to Caesar and said, if you make us this authority figure, we'll pay you X percentage of the money. You can get rich off of it. And out of doing this, Ananias, at this period of time, with the exception of the king himself, is the wealthiest man to reside in the city of Israel. Another element in that is that it's recorded in several places outside of the Bible that part of how Ananias enriched himself was by taking money that had been given for the Levites, for those serving in pastoral roles and priestly roles in the temple, and he kept it for himself. So he stole money from the people subordinate to him, put it in his own pocket, and has done this just to build a fortune for himself. Interestingly, he really is a fairly corrupt guy, and Paul's accusations are more appropriate than perhaps even Paul himself knows at the moment. But they stand true in spite of the fact that he walked them back. So the initial discussion starts. It's not going terribly well. Let's go ahead and see how things progress from there. We'll now go ahead and pick up with verses 6 through 11. Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and others Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, my brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe all these things. There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously. We find nothing wrong with this man, they said. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him? The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. We're going to come back to that last verse here in a minute because there's a huge part of what we want to talk about today that's contained in it. But to summarize the story, Paul's standing there. And Paul, it's good to note, has already previously shared his faith with this whole group. He's been out on the steps of the Tower of Antonia, and he's given his testimony. He's told them who Jesus is. All of these people have heard it, and have heard it several times over. And I think Paul is beginning to realize the futility about repeating himself again on this subject matter. And so what he does is quite a shrewd thing. He decides to cause a division to happen within this council. Now, the Sanhedrin, at this point in time, historians like Josephus tell us, is predominantly staffed by men who are known as Sadducees. And Luke, because he's writing to a Gentile audience who doesn't have a lot of familiarity with Judaism, starts to spell out what some of the beliefs are that the Sadducees have. But in general, it's good to note the Sadducees tended to be some of the wealthier, more aristocratic people who were in Jerusalem. They highly revered the first 5 books of the Bible, but were fairly disregarding of the prophets and the other writings that came afterwards. So they focus in mainly on that. And one of the big beliefs that the Sadducees have, which we see them confront Jesus about in his lifetime, is that they don't believe there's such a thing as an afterlife. They think a person's here on earth, they die, and that's the end of the story. Now I have to say, just as a personal observation, if you're living a fairly secular lifestyle, and you're doing basically what you want to, and you have a whole lot of money to go to those ends, it might be convenient to think there was no afterlife. Might be convenient to think I'm not going to be held accountable for it. There are many people, I think today, who take some comfort in that idea, that hopefully this is the end of it, because what I'm doing right now, I'm going to have to answer for, otherwise I don't particularly like that idea. And so, for the Sadducees, this seems to be part of the picture. The Pharisees, on the other hand, are the more theologically conservative camp within Judaism. They respect the whole New Testament as being authoritative, and as part of that, they have a thorough belief in what the Old Testament spells out about there being a life after death, where you are raised up and you stand before God in judgment, and he gives you an answer one way or the other as to if you're going to heaven or hell. We see that theme happen in the Old Testament in several places, like the book of Psalms. And so for the Pharisees, they value that and believe that. Now, one of the things that Luke asserts is that the Sadducees don't actually believe in angels or spirits. This isn't quite on from what we see outside of the Bible and literature, but I think a good explanation of it is that although they believed in those things, they actually didn't believe in the realm, in a separate realm in which those creatures abide. They believed that spiritual forces existed, but not that there was some secondary realm like heaven where they might exist within or transition between. And so for these leaders, they thought it was there, but not actually that it had a separate realm, or that there's this afterlife that the Pharisees would have thought. Paul, having been a Pharisee, having grown up a Pharisee, asserts right off the bat, you guys, I'll tell you why I'm here today. The real big issue is because I believe there's a resurrection. I believe that's the case. Now, of course, Paul is accurate in that he does believe in a resurrection. In fact, he specifically believes in a resurrection of Jesus Christ himself, and a resurrection of all who believe in him as a result of that. But Paul doesn't delve into those details. Instead, in effect, he turns to 1/3 of the room and says, they're trying to hurt me because I'm like you. And immediately that stirs up a conflict. Soon people are fighting with each other. Some of the Pharisees are saying, you know what, it might have been an angel appeared to him and said this to him. What if he actually did receive some sort of supernatural knowledge? He's conveying that. And the Sadducees are quickly saying, absolutely not. That's not what happened. You guys are off your rocker. Forget about it. And so this fight happens, and it builds in tension so profoundly that Lysias decides the only safe thing to do is to grab Paul and get him out of here right now. He's worried that Paul will be torn limb from limb by this group because they're about to kill each other and they'll want to kill him in the process. So Paul is pulled out of the room, and Lysias probably has a lot of questions remaining about who Paul is. But one thing that was conspicuously absent in this trial, as it happens before the Sanhedrin, is anybody actually raising any sort of criminal complaint against Paul. Nobody said he was a terrorist at this point in time. Nobody said he's murdered anybody or raped somebody or something like that. Those are crimes that he actually could answer for if he'd done. Instead, it's all about the Jewish law. And in a sense, Lysias has actually gotten some answers to who Paul is now. And that last verse I want us to focus in on in that section that we just read. So that's verse 11. It says, the following night the Lord stood near Paul and said, take courage, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. Now, in the actual Greek, and we can see this in some of the more literal translations, these are almost contingent clauses. They're related to each other, and it's as if one builds on the other. In effect, Jesus appears in a vision or in physical form before the Apostle Paul. And what he says to him is, Paul, you did a good job. You shared who I was with these people. You told them who I was. And because you followed through with that, I'm now sending you to Rome. So even though there's reason to think you might get killed here, don't worry about it. I've decided you're going somewhere else. You're going to be taken care of. There's some natural questions, I think, that pour out of this, though. Why was God happy that Paul shared who he was with these people? Did we see recorded anywhere in the last few chapters that anybody accepted Jesus because of it? No, not a single person. These were all really hard-hearted people. And in fact, God had said, Paul retelling a vision that he'd had previously, had said God had informed him years before that he didn't want him to preach in Jerusalem at that time because these people were so hard-hearted that they weren't going to hear it. So if nobody came to Jesus because of Paul sharing who Jesus was, why on earth was it important to God? And I want to suggest two things to you with this. First of all, I think sometimes in our lives we look at somebody and think with how tough and hard-hearted that person is, there's no way they'll ever find Jesus. And the interesting part is, those barriers that seem impossible to us, God can topple over. I've seen this at points in my life. And in fact, for Paul himself, most people in Paul's youth, when he was out on killing sprees, rounding up Christians and arresting them and having them tried for heresy and often killed as a result of it, the average person looking at Paul at that point in time probably would have said, well, you can convince me that a whole lot of people will find Jesus, but not that guy ever. There is no way. And yet, that's exactly what happened. Paul did find Jesus. He turned his life over to him. Another thing I want to point out here is that I think God is often looking for opportunities, even if people are too hard-hearted to receive it. I think God is often looking for opportunities for who he is to be put in front of people. Because someday we're all going to answer for how we responded to that one big question in our life. That question of who Jesus is, a lot hangs on it. And this is, here we're using the word of the Lloyd, not the word of the Lord, I'll warn you. But I do think that there's going to come a day where we're going to stand before God and we're going to be held accountable for our actions. And I think at that point, God's going to replay a bit of a video strip. When we say, God, it wasn't my fault I didn't follow you. I didn't really have a chance. Why are you doing this to me? He's going to look back and say, do you remember when Paul was on the Tower of Antonia's steps and he was proclaiming who I was to you? Well, that's part of this story. And every other situation where we heard the truth of who Jesus was, if we choose to spend eternity in hell rather than being willing to accept the free gift God gives us of salvation, we'll be accountable for that. And this speaks to the importance in our own lives of us having those conversations with others, which we'll come back to at the end of our message. So Paul, at this point, though, picking back up on the passage, is in grave danger. He has a whole lot of people who want him gone. They've wanted to kill him every time they've seen him, and yet he doesn't seem to be imminently about to be released. So we'll continue now with verses 12 through 22 and see how things progress. The next morning, some of the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priests and to the elders and said, we've taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we've killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We are ready to kill him before he gets here. But when the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him. So he took him to the commander. The centurion said, Paul, the prisoner, sent for me to ask me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you. The commander took the young man by the hand and drew him aside and asked, what is it you want to tell me? He said, some of the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now and waiting for your consent to their request. The commander dismissed the young man with this warning. Don't tell anyone that you have reported this to me. All right. So we talk about hard-hearted people, and I don't know how hard-hearted the person you've encountered in your life, but for Paul, he's ticking a really high box here on a list, because these people are in fact so hard-hearted that after hearing him and hearing him talk about Jesus, the very next day, after they've been fighting with each other, a group of them get together, of over 40 of them, and they say, we're not going to eat anything, we're not going to drink anything, we'll consume nothing until we have put Paul in a grave. In short, They want to murder this guy. He disagrees with them. They won't stand for that, and so they're going to find a way to kill him. And so 40 or more people have gotten together. They have a plan. And logistically, if you think about it, even if there's a big group of guards that are there with Paul, if an ambush is set up right, they've got a pretty good chance of making it happen, especially if they're willing to disregard their own lives in the process. It's a predictable trail that leads between the Tower of Antonia and the chamber of hewn stone where the Sanhedrin meets. All they need to do is set up some guys along the way, a few people who know how to use a bow and arrow, or even just a whole handful of people with big rocks on second-story windows. Could do a whole lot to kill Paul really quick as he made that trip. So this is a very viable threat. Unbeknownst to this group, who go to the religious leaders and actually ask for their endorsement, they give the endorsement, say, let's do this, let's kill this guy. Unbeknownst to them, one of Paul's family members happens to be nearby listening to this, perhaps serving in the temple at this point in time. And so Paul's sister's son, or Paul's nephew, is there. Now, some of you might take note, I don't remember hearing Paul had a sister. And this is, in fact, the first time in the New Testament we hear about it. We hear it mentioned here. But the New Testament's purpose isn't to give an exhaustive list of Paul's genealogy. It's merely telling us some of the historical events. So apparently, Paul has a sister in Jerusalem. Her son has some service role in the temple. He hears what's going on, and to his credit, he goes to Paul and tells him, you got to watch out. If they take you where they mean to take you tomorrow, you're going to die on the way. And Paul responds to that, probably in part using his sway as a Roman citizen, and goes ahead and says, let's go ahead and have you go to the commander and tell Lysias what's going on. The nephew does that. Lysias hears, and his instruction to Paul's nephew is, don't tell anybody about this. Now, for Lysias, it is very important. Paul's a Roman citizen under his protection, and although he might be a little on the fence exactly as to how much to blame Paul is for whatever's going on, he has a high responsibility to protect this Roman citizen, and if this citizen dies because of his negligence, it's the sort of thing he might actually lose his job over. So this is a good thing for him to know, and it's a kind of threat that he's going to take very seriously because of Paul's station, because Paul has this background where one of his family members apparently was so important that citizenship was given to him without him having to go pay for it or earn it somehow. All right, let's finish the passage now and see how things conclude. We'll now read verses 23 through 35. Then he called 2 of his centurions and ordered them, get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide horses for Paul, so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix. He wrote a note as follows: Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency, Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him. But I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he was a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found that the accusation had to do with questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. Also, I ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him. So, the soldiers, carrying out their orders, took Paul with them during the night and brought him as far as Antipatris. The next day, they let the cavalry go on with him, while they returned to the barracks. When the cavalry arrived at Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will hear your case when your accusers get here. Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. All right, we're talking about a bunch of geographic locations. I imagine most of them don't jump out at you as commonly known things. Let's just briefly look at a map and see where these areas are we're talking about. So this is a map of Paul's 4th missionary journey. We're not there yet, but we can use this as an area of reference. So you can see we've got Rome and Greece and the northern Middle East. Down here is Egypt and the northern part of Africa. And over here is where Jerusalem is. So Jerusalem stands by the Dead Sea. The Sea of Galilee is up there. And ultimately, Paul needs to travel up to Caesarea. If we jump to the next slide, we can see a zoom in of this region. So here's Jerusalem and the common route that would have been taken to Antipatris and up to Caesarea. It's about a 60-mile journey total, which means about 30 miles per day. as they're making this trip. And ultimately, as we see here, what happens is that the commander there in Jerusalem decides, I'm going to pass this one up the food chain. This is a risky thing. If I let this guy go and I'm not supposed to, then I'll be in trouble for it. But on the other hand, we may have rioting in the streets. On the other hand, if I kill him and I'm not supposed to, I could really be in trouble. And so he decides he's going to send him off to Caesarea. It's good to know. You might be wondering, why is it that the governor of the area is in Caesarea? And the reason is because by Roman standards, Caesarea was considered the capital of the state that Jerusalem was in. And yet, from the Jewish perspective, and from, frankly, most of the culture of most of the people around there, Jerusalem would have been considered the capital city. And so there is this large garrison of troops that's left in Jerusalem at all times, commanded by Lysias to keep the peace there. But Lysias now wants to hand this off to the person in rank above him, and he also wants to get Paul to safety. He knows he's in imminent danger, and so he sends off a large contingent of both foot soldiers, 200 foot soldiers, several spearmen, and then also a bunch of cavalrymen, and puts Paul on a horse. And the first day, starting at 9 p.m., they go through the night and sprint onward to Antipatris. Antipatris happens to be the location where a little, in effect, police station along the roadways is present. We actually can see archaeological remnants of this today. But there was a military stronghold there, and part of the reason was the Roman government liked to have every 20 to 30 miles on Roman roadways a little police depot where if there were highwaymen or somebody doing something criminal, they could quickly send out a contingent of guards or soldiers to go try to get that figured out and solved. They didn't want to have a 2-day response time to any crime that took place. So they stop overnight there, and then the cavalry continues on with Paul and takes him to Caesarea. In the end of the passage, we hear that once he arrives, Felix, who we'll hear more about next week, who's the governor of this region, asks Paul where he's from. And probably part of this is most Roman politicians are smart enough to know that if there's a controversial decision to be made, it's better to have somebody else make it. Don't want to be responsible for it. And so, by asking Paul where he's from, Paul says he's from Cilicia, which is the state in which Tarsus, his hometown, is located. Felix is trying to figure out, can I just send you off to that guy? And maybe he can deal with this. He can sort out the mess. Unfortunately for Felix, the Roman emperor has actually included that territory in his territory. So he's responsible for Paul's hometown and responsible for Jerusalem itself. There's no way he's getting out of this. He's just got to go ahead and make the decision himself. And so he welcomes Paul there. He says, welcome home. You wait, and then we're going to have more people come, and we'll have your trial there as soon as we can. And that's where the passage will pick up next week. So the natural question is, what do we do with this passage? How do we apply this to our life? And my challenge to you guys is, I suspect in all of your lives, you probably know somebody who is really firmly against Christianity, who has a brick wall up. Show of hands, anybody ever met somebody like that? Yeah, that's kind of what I thought. Those are tough situations, right? It's scary because we don't want to damage relationships any further. And again, I'm not saying you go find that person and go hit them on the head with a Bible or go corner them and try to argue on anything with them. But what we see today through the life of the Apostle Paul is God called Paul and counted it as a righteous thing when he went before people who were incredibly hostile towards Jesus and shared who Jesus was with them. Obviously, it didn't make Paul more popular. He didn't become a really well-loved guy because he made that decision, and yet it was the very decision God called him to. And part of why God says he's willing to trust Paul to go on to Rome and continue there is because Paul's done that very thing. The hard part with that means that there's probably people in our lives too that are really strongly against Christianity. I know when I was a street evangelist years ago in Las Vegas, I found that about 1 in 20 people, and they say statistically about 1 in 20 people in America are hostile towards the gospel. And I remember I would run into people and strike up a conversation, and you could just tell that whatever it might have been, maybe they had a bad experience, maybe they were burned by somebody, maybe they just didn't want to hear about the moral accountability of it, whatever it might have been, they were angry that the name of Jesus would even be mentioned. I don't know if that carries through to other world religions, but we can certainly see it in Christianity, and probably you can see it some places in your life. The challenge we have this week is to look and pray and seek opportunities that God gives us to talk to people who are in that position about who Jesus is. We might think it's hopeless, we might think it's beyond anything happening, but it's not beyond God. And we actually have a responsibility to do it, even in the hard times. So at this point, I'm going to ask our leadership to come forward and to lead us in our communion offering meditations. I'll ask those who are serving the elements too as well. And as they do, I'll ask you guys to join me as we pray about this. Heavenly Father, we worry way too often about what other people are going to think instead of what you desire. Father, I pray that you'd help us to see who in our life needs to hear about you. And Lord, I pray that you would guide us by your Spirit to know exactly the right opportunity and to have the boldness to speak your name when it comes out. Father, if there's somebody here today who's in that camp, maybe they were drugged here by a friend or family member, Lord, I pray you'd help us to show your love to them. I pray your kindness would be apparent. And I just pray you'd soften their hearts where they'd be open to that opportunity. Help us to be more focused about what your desire is than our own. We pray that you would give us boldness and courage. And we ask these things in Jesus Christ's name and merit, Lord. Amen.